Now let's implement DOM clothing. What I did is I copy pasted 3.1 to 3.2 and updated the naming to be 3.2. And now I want us to update what we did in the previous subsection to correspond to DOM clothing. So I want us to actually start from the implementers. The implementers over here won't be the implementer, but we said that each one of these will be a clothing formatter. So let's start by updating this to be the iClothing formatter, and let's give it the methods that we talked about. This should be one returning a URI, which is format image URL. The second one will return a string and will be format title, and the last one will be similar to this, but it will be format description. Now that we have this, then we can update the name of the file and we can get rid of the two concrete implementers from beforehand. Also, let's update this folder from implementers to be clothing formatters. Now that we have this, let's go to the abstractions folder. Let's update the abstraction from being the abstraction to be the clothing view. So let's say that this is the clothing view and it has internally the clothing formatter. Let's update the name of this as well and the name of the protected property to be clothing formatter as well. So comparing what we did up until now to the diagram that we created, so we have the iClothing formatter, it's an interface, and it has the following three methods, which I see we have a typo here. This should be URL. And we now created the clothing view, which is an abstract class that has in it as a protected property the clothing formatter. What we need to still add over here is the display method that displays the underlying clothing item to, in our case, the console. So let's create over here the method called display, and that's all we need for the clothing view. Now let's delete the two refined abstractions, and all we need to do is create the clothing items and the formatters for the clothing items, and finally the various views. So let's create over here a new folder and let's call it the clothing items. And over here, let's create the shoe. Now, before we implement the shoe, I want to go back to the abstraction and update the file name to be clothing view, and likewise for the folder to be clothing views. And now that we have this, then it updated the order a bit. So we have the clothing formatters, the clothing views, and over here, the clothing items. Now for the implementation of the shoe, let's say that this is a record called shoe, and it has in it the properties that we looked at in the previous section. Likewise, we also have the polo shirt, which also has the properties corresponding to what we looked at in the previous section. Next, we have the dress, and you already know the drill. Let's simply paste over here the properties that we looked at, and off camera, I'll create the three remaining items. So here we have it, a class for each one of the 6 clothing items. And now all we need to do is create the clothing formatters, which again is the adapter from the clothing item to what the various views expect, which is the format image URL, format title, and format description. So same drill like before, we'll create now one of the clothing formatters. Let's do it for the shoe. And off camera, I'll create all the rest of the clothing formatters. And of course, you'll have the source code available for you to look at. So let's create the shoe clothing formatter. This will be the concretion of the iClothing formatter, and this will need to have the various 3 methods. Now, the shoe clothing formatter, of course, will also need a shoe. So I'd say that we have over here the shoe, and now when formatting the description, then we can return over here some string that is a manipulation on the shoe. For the image URL, then same drill, I'll put here something, and likewise for the title. Okay, so I filled in the format image URL, which is just manipulation on the shoe, and likewise for the title, then we have some manipulation on the title. Now, the formatter is going to be used by one of the views. So over here, we are going to have 3 views: the detailed, the compact, and the mini. Let's start with the detailed clothing view, where the detailed clothing view is going to extend the clothing view, and we'll need to have here the method called display. We'll also need to receive the iClothing formatter clothing formatter and pass it down to the base. And now what we can do, and this is the beauty and the power of this design pattern, is we can now say clothing formatter and access the image URL, and this can be whatever clothing item that we want. When we have new clothing items, all we need to do is to create their formatter, and that's it. We can plug and play all the various views and the formatters with one another. So now let me write off camera the other clothing views and the other clothing formatters, and then let's review them. So overall, what we have is as follows. We have 6 clothing formatters corresponding to the 6 clothing items, where these are the implementers. So this is the implementer, and these are the concrete implementers. We then have the clothing items, which are adapted to the formatters or by the formatters. Then we have the clothing views, which is the abstraction and the refined abstractions. And overall, we have 3 refined abstractions, where each one of the refined abstractions uses the clothing formatter differently. So, for example, the compact clothing view will use the clothing formatter differently than the detailed clothing view. Plus, the overall implementation is different. So over here, we're saying detailed view, and over here, we're saying compact view. And in real applications, this can be, for example, views of promotions. Perhaps you have a sale and you want to display it differently to the user so they know there's a sale. I'm sure you can imagine how the views over here can grow over time with different types of views. We then have each one of the formatters, the implementers, manipulating the underlying object differently. So over here, for example, in the description of the jeans, then we're saying jeans.wash. But in the shoes, then we're talking about the color and whether or not it's athletic, etc. Finally, the way it is used by the client is as follows. The client will have all the various items. So they'll have shoes, they'll have shirts, etc., etc. And they can now mix and match, and they can create different views based on whatever they like. So, for example, the detailed shoe view will be created by taking the shoe formatter for the specific shoe instance that we have. But we could have also very easily created not the detailed shoe view, but actually the compact clothing view. And this won't be detailed, this will be compact. And eventually, all of the various objects have the display method, which knows how to display that specific view based on that specific formatter. So when we call display for all these various views, then this will display different values depending on how we constructed the underlying objects. For example, let's take the last one. We have the mini view of tank top. This corresponds to this line over here in calling mini tank top view dot display. If we look at this variable, then we can see that this is created via a mini clothing view, which has in it the tank top formatter. The tank top is a sports top that has the following values. It has its specific formatter that for the image creates the path to the underlying image, which is tank top underline white, and we have some title overlay on top of it that says tank top size S. So I hope you can see why this pattern can be very powerful and why for the right use cases, it can make your life much easier. What I want us to do now is a quick recap of this section and then talk about the benefits and drawbacks of using this pattern. So in this section, we implemented the bridge design pattern twice. In the first time, we implemented it based on the base class diagram where we have abstractions and implementers. Like we said, we have the abstraction that has an implementer, and each one of the refined abstractions extends the abstraction and can use the implementer differently if they'd like. We then have the implementer. The implementer is just an interface that exposes some behavior or some properties, and we have the concrete implementers, each one implementing the implementer differently. Like we said, this allows the client to construct different representations based on the combinations that they'd like. After doing this, then we implemented Don't Train Clothing. We did the same thing, but this time we also have another layer, which are the underlying clothing items. We created each one of the clothing items that can stay sort of pure from a domain point of view, where they contain only what's relevant for that type. We then have the clothing formatters, which are adapters that take the clothing items and know how to expose the format description, format image URL, and format title. This is the implementer, and this is what will be used by the abstraction, which is the clothing view. The clothing view has a clothing formatter and again exposes some behavior that now we can have each one of the refined abstractions. In our case, it's the clothing views, the various clothing views. They can manipulate the clothing formatter differently and behave differently altogether. This allows the client to create various clothing items and combine the formatters with the views in various ways, creating various views of the various underlying clothing items. Hopefully this wasn't too hard to comprehend. I know the cognitive load can be a bit high, specifically in this design pattern, so take the time, look at the source code, rewatch some of the previous subsections if needed, and when you feel like you have a good understanding of the design pattern, then move on with me to the next and final section, which will cover the benefits and the drawbacks of this design pattern.